We have two HyperX Alloy Origins Cores here today, one with the HyperX Red switches and one with the HyperX Aqua switches. So I'm here to help you decide which switch you should get and why. Hey guys, this is Betty from Switch and Click, and today I will be comparing the HyperX Red switches versus the HyperX Aqua switches on a Alloy Origins Core. Now I have reviewed these two keyboards in depth with these switches available, and I'll link those on the side cards here if you're interested in that. As you know, the HyperX Alloy Origins Core, I will now call it the AOC, has been one of our favorite mechanical keyboards under $100. And the reason for that is it's pretty much the only keyboard that we've used under $100 that has a full aluminum frame. And it also has an integrated plate, and the switches are really smooth. The only downside is that the stabilizers aren't exactly the best. And even with simple modifications, it's not gonna fix it unless you desolder some of those switches out. But that's not really the topic today. If you do wanna see those in-depth reviews, they're here, and then of course they're in the show notes down below. All right, so let's talk about the two switches. Of course, if you go to HyperX's switch comparison page, you'll see that they're almost identical. The Reds and the Aquas have pretty much identical statistics. They both have spring force of about 45 grams. The travel distance of each switch is about 3.8 millimeters, and the actuation distance, the distance from the start of the key press to where the switch registers your key press to the PC, is 1.8 millimeters. And they both have a lifespan of about 80 million key presses. So they're durable. They're a little bit faster than Cherry MX switches, and the spring force is relatively light compared to a lot of other switches as well. And if you look really closely, the LED isn't part of the PCB itself. Rather, the LED is soldered into the switch and sits right on top of that little hole in the switch itself. So if you do desolder these switches, it's going to involve a little bit of extra work compared to switches of keyboards without RGBs. All right, so now that their statistics look really similar, what exactly is the difference between them? Well, primarily it's the switch type. So if you haven't seen our linear versus tactile versus clicky switch guide, then it'll be linked right here. But that video will really help you out in learning exactly what a linear switch is and a tactile switch and all that, with a bunch of different sound samples and switch options as well. But the main difference is Red switches are linear and Aqua switches are tactile. And that's it for the video. I'll see you next time. No, just kidding. There's definitely a little bit of more differences than that. They're pretty subtle though, but I guess the best way really would be to try it out, but I'll try my best to really explain what the differences are, and especially the difference of the switches compared to other more common switches on the market that you might have already felt and can compare them to. But if you haven't seen that video, linear versus tactile versus clicky, I'll explain briefly here what linear switches are and what tactile switches are. So linear switches they're called linear because there's no variation of the key press really. It's a straight way down with about the same spring force throughout, except the bottom out tends to be a little bit heavier because, as you know, Hooke's law and all that jazz. But anyways, there's no bump. It's a straight key press. It's very consistent. It's smooth. And then a tactile switch is exactly what it's called. It has a tactile bump in the middle that allows you to feel that the key has been pressed. You don't get that on the linear switch. So as a preface, sort of a disclaimer, a lot of the information presented here will be very subjective and in my own opinion, because, well, switches are a preference. But to me, the Reds feel extremely smooth straight out of the box. These are stock switches, neither are lubed because they're all soldered to the board, and I'm not willing to desolder them or any of that jazz. Although I really love if HyperX would sell these switches just in batches, in bags, and you can buy them and use them for your custom boards or whatever. That would be really good. But anyways, the Reds feel very, very smooth. Now I'm saying this in comparison to switches such as HyperX Reds, such as Gateron Reds, and KL Box Reds. So in terms of smoothness, they're very similar to Gateron Reds, but they make a little bit less noise in the overall movement, and I would say their housing is a little bit tighter. There's less stem wobble compared to Gateron Reds. And if you're listening really closely, which I will do a sound demo of the Reds really close without the keycap, with the keycap, and then the Aquas really close without the keycap and with the keycaps on. So that's coming up really soon. So when listening really closely, there appears to be no spring ping. Now HyperX doesn't say whether these are lubed from the factory or not, so I'm going to assume that they're stock switches, but for some reason the spring doesn't really produce as much noise as other stock switches that I've used before, even very nice linears such as Novelty Creams or Gateron Ink Blacks. And then the sounds when you use the HyperX Reds come from the bottom out sounds, and bottoming out just means that you press the key as far as it would go and it can't go anymore. Essentially, you're hitting the bottom of the switch, and that's why it's called bottoming out. The Reds, they don't really sound during the key press, but they sound at that bottoming out when it hits the end. And their pitch is a little bit higher pitched than the Aqua switches. So hopefully you can hear that during the sound comparison that's gonna happen right now. All right, so those were the sound demos. The microphone was very close to the switches, and keep in mind that they're both on the exact same keyboard. The only thing that's different is the switch itself. It has the same keycaps, it has the exact same build, everything is the same. So in terms of the Aquas, they have some pre-travel, and pre-travel basically means the distance that the switch can move before you hit that tactile bump where you need to press a little bit harder to overcome that barrier. Most switches that I've used that are tactile do have this pre-travel. It's pretty common, however, some switches nowadays are putting that bump right in the very beginning so that you apply a lot of force at first and you don't really bottom out ever. So that's how I feel about these Aquas. In terms of bottoming out, it doesn't happen very often unless I'm typing extremely fast. Once you hit the bump, you sort of know it's time to back off and move on to the next key that you're typing. So in terms of the bump itself, compared to a common tactile switch such as the Cherry MX Browns, the Aquas have a better bump. And what this means as better, I mean is more pronounced and more tactile. You feel it a lot better. It doesn't feel like it's almost a linear switch. You definitely feel and hear some kind of tactile bump, and by hear I mean it just adds a little bit of extraneous noises because there's more movement during the key press. But the tactile bump isn't nearly as tactile as some of these higher end tactile switches such as Glorious Pandas, which I have reviewed, and that'll be right here if you're interested. Drop Holy Pandas, which I'm getting today, T1s, Zelios, things like that. So it's not a very, very pronounced bump, and it might not satisfy the amount of tactility that you want. Personally, I feel that it's enough if you want to switch from your typical keyboard to something that's mechanical. So the bottom out sounds of the Aquas are slightly higher pitched, along with the additional noise that happens throughout all of its movement. But there's no click, there's no audible click, so keep that in mind. I would say both keyboards are relatively loud and not really appropriate for the office. Now, if you do want to make them slightly appropriate, I would consider adding O-rings, but those make them feel quite mushy and not really as satisfying to type on. But that's my preference. Some people actually like O-rings. It's really up to you. All right, so that was a basic comparison between the HyperX Reds and the HyperX Aquas. If you have any additional questions about them, feel free to put them in the comments below and I'll try my best to answer them. But if not, we do have a Discord community that loves answering questions, has a ton of helpful people that are so much more experienced than me in the mechanical keyboard space, as well as the PC space, the audiophile, all those spaces. There are people there that can help you. So I'll link the Discord down below as well if you want to join. No pressure, of course, it's up to you. Now let's get on to some of the nitty-gritty details, I suppose. Things like which switch is better for typing. I suppose some of these questions you may already know the answer to, or you may not care, but there is a table of contents down below. If you are just switching from your typical keyboard that you use in the office to a mechanical keyboard, I think that some of these questions might be good to consider when choosing your switch. So first, which one's better for typing? And these are all opinionated. Obviously, some people can tell you something completely different. So in my opinion and usage, Aquas are definitely easier for typing than the Reds. I can type almost 10 words per minute faster on the Aqua than the Reds. And the reason is there's a bump. So with the bump there, you know that when you feel the bump, you're gonna back off. Unlike the Reds, where there's no bump and you're bottoming out every single key press, unless you know sort of where to gauge the actuation point and you're doing some kind of floating typing style. But with that, I tend to find that there's a lot more typos than if you just bottom out every press. So the Aquas definitely have the advantage here. They are very easy to use. It's not a hard switch between your typical membrane keyboard, which already has that very minimal tactile bump from where you press in the rubber dome. So it's similar to that. It's definitely more pronounced and has better performance. It's very consistent, each key press, and you're not gonna have your rubber dome get stuck. So despite the same spring weight of 45 grams for Aquas and Reds, the Aquas feel slightly heavier, which to me is better for typing, because if something's too light, you accidentally press it, you accidentally actuate it, and then suddenly a typo appears and you have to press backspace. So with the Aquas, you have to add a little bit more force at that bump to overcome the bump, then finish the press. So they feel slightly heavier. On the Reds, you're probably bottoming out every press and typos are much more common. To me, they're relatively lightweight switches, and that makes typos even more common. The heavier the switch, the more accurate I find my typing speed. So that's for typing. With typing, the Aquas are my recommendation there. However, if you spend the majority of your time gaming, then it's going to be the other way around. I'm going to recommend Red switches here if you're spending over 60% of the time gaming instead. It's sort of the opposite is true. In gaming, the tactile bump takes away from the feeling rather than moves towards what you want. It's a very distracting bump, especially if you're pressing the same key over and over and over again, such as the spacebar or WASD or something like that. The bump can get really annoying, whereas the linear switch is more satisfying and doesn't provide as much of a distraction when you're using it. Adding in that additional force at the beginning of the Aqua switches can also increase the amount of time that it takes you to actuate, which will decrease your response time, and you definitely don't want that when you're doing some serious gaming. However, if you're playing something like Stardew Valley or some casual MMORPG, then it really doesn't matter which switch you choose. Just choose the one that feels better to you and fits all your needs. Now, of course, in game, you're probably gonna have to type out a few things, such as your username, your password, talk trash, just kidding, say nice things about other people in game. But of course, you might experience some typos at first, but over time you definitely get used to it. I hated linear switches at first. They were too light. They gave me too many typos, but then over time, you just start to get used to them. So I'm currently using linear switches as my main daily driver, and it's super satisfying. I enjoy the bottoming out feeling and the sound, but you know, it's up to you. All right, so which one should you get if this is your first ever mechanical keyboard and you're switching from a membrane keyboard? For beginners, I'm gonna recommend tactile switches such as the Aquas. If you're new to mechanical keyboards, linear switches do tend to be a little bit difficult to get used to. It's not impossible and it's not recommended. Typos are just more common, but I suppose over time, you'll tend to move towards or gravitate towards what you think your preferences will be. There's so many switches to try. It's really hard to say you're not gonna like linears because there's heavy linears, there's lightweight linears. There's linears where you feel the spring force near the beginning or near the end. Like there's just so much variety there. So in terms of tactile, it's the same way. There's so much variety out there. There's more tactility, and if you lube your switches, you get a massive different variety as well in terms of buttery feel or a soft tactile bump or whatever you would like. To beginners, I say pick one, try it out. If you don't like it, then you know not to try it again next time. And if you do like it, then you sort of know that you like whatever you picked, and maybe try something similar but a little bit different next time. And of course, the best way is probably to buy a switch tester from either online or at the store. I know it's not very easy to buy them at the store nowadays though. But with these HyperX switches, you just have to go out and try the board because they don't really sell their switches singularly and they're not available on switch testers. So anyways, I hope that really helped you out. I know it was a little bit long for a video just about switches or about two different switches. But if you're deciding between HyperX Reds or HyperX Aquas on any HyperX board, I hope this really helped you out. I know on paper they appear to be very similar and it's hard to make that decision. So here we are. If you're interested in the in-depth reviews of the Alloy Origins Core, check out all these things over here. We also did the HyperX Alloy FPS as well. And perhaps we'll do some of the full-size boards in the future, but I know you guys don't really like full-size boards, so I may not do that ever. We'll see. All right, peace out. Gotta take my dog to the vet.